I want to continue talking about how some of the traditional things we think about how foreign policy is made potentially being changed by social media. And in particular, for decades, there's been a long-standing set of discussions around the relationship between, or the effect of public opinion on foreign policy in democracies like the United States. And in particular, we always ask this question, like, what's this sort of triangular relationship between the media, government, and public opinion? And the question I want to ask in this segment is, how is social media changing that? Or how does that relationship change when we throw social media into the equation? And to be clear, at this point, I'm not informing you about any research or conclusions that is complete. I'm really speculating a little bit, because one of the things I do think we want to do in this course is ask questions, even when we don't know the answers. So here's a traditional view, and if this looks familiar to you, this is a table that comes out of the 4th edition of the textbook. If you've got the 5th edition, there's a slightly different table that I'll show you in a minute. But basically, there's 3 models of influence that people hypothesize to show the relationship between the executive branch, the media, and public opinion. Right? In the first one, sort of the executive can set the agenda by giving speeches and making policy proposals. The media then go and cover it, and public opinion follows what the media covers. So essentially, the executive has a lot of power in this model. There's another model that really sees the media as being independent, and the media can decide what it wants to put on the front page, what it wants to give a lot of time to on the nightly news. So it sets the agenda, and public opinion, as in the first model, follows the media, but then it's got the executive following public opinion. So the big difference between the first and the second models is, in the first model, the executive is driving the bus, and in the second one, the media is driving the bus, and the executive is following. There are some examples of that, but they're really, in foreign policy at least, don't seem to be too many cases where that seems to be the case. Although people sure do love complaining about the role of the media. There's a third model that really sees the public setting the agenda, sometimes actively, sometimes passively. And it sets the agenda in that there's this idea that the media cater to public opinion. Right? The media sort of tries to anticipate which stories the public will read and which ones they want to read, and therefore it's really the public opinion that's leading. The media write stories and show stuff based on what they think the public wants to hear, and then the executive follows that. So in this one, you've really got things reversed from the first model, and now the public is setting the agenda, which maybe is how you think things should be in a democracy. I don't want to necessarily get into the discussion of which of those models holds. My sense is that at different times and on different issues, each of them may seem somewhat true, but probably it's never quite as clean and straightforward as these models make it seem. But when I revised the book for the 5th edition, I added this 4th model. And I'll be honest with you, this is a model that really, I think, tries to account for the phenomenon of Donald Trump, which is the executive leads, but not via the media, right? The executive goes straight to the public via social media, and public opinion then gets shaped by the executive. In some cases, you might say, well, some people agreeing with the executive, some people disagree, sometimes strongly disagreeing with the executive, but nonetheless with the executive totally controlling the agenda, because people are either agreeing with the executive or furiously responding to, as opposed to maybe putting other issues on the agenda that they'd be liking to talk about. And then the media follows. And it's amazing to me, maybe just because I'm an old guy, amazing to me how many stories I read in the news today, for example, in the New York Times, or what I would call a reputable news source, that simply are saying, here's what people said on social media, right? So the media really is following in the sense of reporting on, oh, so-and-so said this on Twitter, and so-and-so said that. So that's, I think, a 4th model that, again, at least some of the time, seems to account for what's going on, and we can debate the extent to which that's true. I think there are 3 new problems or 3 new phenomena that we really want to address. One is competing realities. If you go back 30 or 40 years, when most people got their news from 3 or 4 major news networks or 3 or 4 major newspapers, even if they had different editorial differences, all of the major news sources in any big country, but especially the United States, we would say, were essentially describing the same reality. And now that's no longer the case. You have different news outlets or social media outlets that are essentially have very contradictory notions of what actually is going on in the world, different facts. So it's a very sort of postmodern situation. And in particular, of course, many people are no longer getting their news from these big, what we would call mainstream news outlets, and so there's a fragmentation of the information space. Partly related to that, therefore, there's what we call these echo chambers, right, where people tend not only to choose the news that suits them, but then to be in conversations with people with whom they already agree. Right? So when you're arguing only with people that already agree with you, the belief is you, rather than questioning and maybe weakening and getting more nuance in your views, instead your views just become more and more extreme and and you become more and more convinced of them. That is fed by social media algorithms that we're all subject to, right? What pops up on our Facebook page or just pops up randomly when we're surfing around the internet. What pops up is largely based on what we have already clicked on, right? So we are likely to see, because of these algorithms, YouTube is a really scary example of this, right? With that feature where it just keeps on showing you videos. It shows you stuff that's like what you've already seen. So whatever it is you start thinking is now being reinforced rather than this abstract notion that you should see multiple sides of a story. That's not what these algorithms do. They're set up to do exactly the opposite because they want to keep us clicking and looking for as long as possible. And so in the next chapter of the textbook, in chapter 6, where we talk about psychology and decision making and bias, we talk about confirmation bias, which is the bias in which we tend to give heavier weight to information that confirms what we already believe, as opposed to information that questions what we already believe. Right? When something contradicts what we think, we tend to dismiss it. When it confirms what we already think, we tend to say, yep, that's a reliable source. If you think about how that interacts with social media, we are likely to see more and more things that tell us what we already believe, and we're more likely to believe those things because we already believe them. And the things that might push us in the other direction, we're both less likely to believe them in the first place, and now, because of social media algorithms, we're less likely to see them. So what does all of this mean for public opinion and foreign policy? Well, I think it leads us to think, if we were to go back to those 3 or 4 models I showed earlier in the segment, what are the other possible models out there now? Is there a model now where we think the influencers lead, right? We're all really driven in our foreign policy beliefs by the Kardashians. Is there a model now in which foreign governments lead? If we think about some of the stuff that the Russian government has been up to. Should we really then be focusing on Facebook and social media platforms? Or is it that no one leads? Is it simply that the idea of public opinion as a thing has to go out the window because it's so spectacularly fragmented that we have to think about the problem completely differently? I do not know what the answers to these questions are. I suspect that the right answer is one that's not on this slide, but I don't know what it is. But I do think this reshaping of the relationship between public opinion, media, and social media and foreign policy is one that's going to continue to be quite important in the years to come.